Billions of people will eat bread today. Most of them have no idea that the country that grows a massive share of the world's wheat just told the most powerful economy on earth, no, not later, not under different terms, no. This morning, Donald Trump's administration sent a formal document to Ottawa demanding priority access to Canadian wheat. America first, before Africa, before the Middle East, before Asia, before every nation that depends on Canadian grain to keep its people fed. Mark Carney read it. Then he walked to a podium and rejected every single condition, one by one, in public, on the record. And what happened next sent shockwaves through every grain exchange on the planet. Stay with us, because this is the moment the trade war stopped being about politics and became about something far more primal: food. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now and turn on notifications. This story is moving fast, and we're tracking every development as it breaks. The United States Department of Agriculture and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative issued a combined document this morning with 4 specific demands. The first, American buyers get priority on Canadian wheat shipments before any other country receives a single bushel. That means Egypt. That means Indonesia. That means Ethiopia. Countries where Canadian wheat isn't a commodity, it's a lifeline. The second demand, Canada must abandon its century-old wheat grading standards and realign them to American specifications. The third, American officials gain input into Canadian wheat pricing through a shared cost structure. The fourth, American corporations gain investment access to Canadian grain ports, milling plants, and storage networks. Read those 4 demands together, and you're not looking at a trade negotiation. You're looking at a blueprint to transfer control of a Canadian national food system into American institutional hands. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in Washington anticipated. Carney didn't respond with anger. He didn't respond with political theater. He showed up in Ottawa at 1:29 in the afternoon, flanked by 2 people: Canada's Minister of Agriculture and the Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations World Food Programme. That second name matters. Before Carney said a single word, every journalist in that room understood that Canada's response would not be framed as a 2-country trade dispute. It would be framed as a global humanitarian position. And that framing, that specific, deliberate, calculated framing, is what made this rejection different from every other rejection in this trade war. Keep watching, because what Carney did next didn't just close the door on these 4 demands. It may have permanently shifted who controls the global wheat conversation. And it produced a reaction from international markets and foreign governments within hours that nobody in Washington saw coming. Carney opened with 3 words: Canada says no. Then he spent the next several minutes dismantling each demand with the precision of someone who had been preparing this exact moment for months. On the priority access demand, he stated plainly that granting American buyers first claim on Canadian wheat would force Canada to break food supply commitments to nations in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East, regions where Canadian grain is not a preference but a pillar of national food security. Canada will not place American commercial priority above the food stability of nations depending on Canadian wheat to feed their people. Not for any trade advantage, not under any pressure, not inside any framework Washington might design. On the grading standards demand, he explained that Canadian wheat grading criteria represent 100 years of agricultural knowledge built to serve Canadian farmers, global buyers, and international market standards. Rewriting them to suit American preferences wouldn't open access. It would destroy the quality reputation that makes Canadian wheat among the most sought-after grain on the planet, including by American buyers. On the pricing demand, his answer matched what he had said every time this administration attempted to insert cost control mechanisms into Canadian resource agreements on oil, natural gas, and potash. Canadian assets are priced through market processes that reflect Canadian production costs, global market conditions, and Canadian commercial priorities. External involvement in pricing is not a trade arrangement. It is external control. Canada refuses external control over its assets, regardless of how that control is packaged or what label it is given. On the infrastructure demand, he was equally unambiguous. Canadian grain ports, milling facilities, and storage systems are not investment opportunities available for acquisition through trade pressure. They are national infrastructure that supports Canadian agricultural priorities and Canada's food security commitments to its international partners. Then Carney did something that elevated this rejection from a bilateral response into a geopolitical statement. He announced 3 immediate actions. First, Canada formally delivered its wheat supply commitment framework to the United Nations World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization, officially registering Canada's food supply promises to food-insecure nations as protected national obligations that cannot be overridden by any bilateral trade request from any single buyer, regardless of economic size. Second, Canada announced the completion of long-term wheat supply agreements with 7 countries across the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. 5-year deals providing supply certainty at stable pricing, finalized and announced today, specifically because the American demand for priority access created the political and diplomatic basis to lock in alternative market commitments that would permanently reduce the share of Canadian wheat available to American market pressure. Third, Canada activated a national agricultural governance framework under which the Canada Grain Commission was directed to treat all supply distribution decisions as national priority determinations, evaluating Canada's food security obligations, its international humanitarian commitments, and its national commercial interests before any distribution to any buyer. The message to Washington was institutional and permanent. The United States is one factor in Canada's wheat distribution calculus. It is not the dominant factor. No demand from Washington will change that calculation. The markets responded within minutes. Canadian wheat futures rose as the long-term supply deals with Middle Eastern and African buyers created a floor of demand certainty that reduced supply uncertainty for international purchasers. American grain buyers watching those futures absorbed the implication in real time. A significant portion of Canadian wheat supply had just been committed under multi-year contracts to non-American partners, tightening the future availability of Canadian wheat on the open market that American buyers rely on. The demand designed to guarantee American access had triggered a Canadian response that materially reduced future American access in ways the administration had not modeled. Senators from agricultural states began fielding calls from grain buyers within hours. The World Food Programme released a statement welcoming Canada's formal submission of its supply commitment framework. Governments across the regions Carney named issued statements of gratitude before the trading day closed. 3 scenarios now sit on the table. In the first, the combination of global food security framing and domestic American agricultural pressure forces the administration to withdraw the wheat demands within 30 days. Canada's long-term supply deals with Middle Eastern and African partners remain in place as permanent commercial relationships. The National Agricultural Governance Framework stays active as standing policy for all future grain distribution decisions. A broader bilateral negotiation resumes with wheat access demands removed because the political and economic cost of maintaining them has become undeniable. In the second scenario, the administration responds by imposing targeted trade measures against Canadian agricultural exports into the American market. Canada activates its full agricultural response package, counter-tariffs on American farm products from agricultural states, creating the sharpest political pressure on the administration from its own voter base. The combination of Canadian counter-tariffs on American agricultural goods and tightened Canadian wheat availability for American buyers as long-term contracts direct growing supply toward non-American partners generates agricultural sector economic impacts on the American side that exceed anything earlier phases of this trade war produced. Political pressure from American farming groups reaches the threshold that forces real administration flexibility within 60 days. In the third, Canada emerges from this trade war as a permanently more central actor in global food security governance. The nations receiving long-term supply certainty from Canada build deeper commercial and diplomatic ties with Ottawa that extend beyond wheat into agricultural technology, water management, and food system development. The demand, designed to subordinate Canadian wheat to American commercial priority, has instead deepened Canada's integration into the global food security architecture that depends on it. This morning, Donald Trump tried to rewrite Canada's role in the story of how the world gets fed. He tried to position American commercial access as the first claim, ahead of every other nation's food security need, ahead of every existing supply commitment, ahead of every country that counts on Canadian grain to keep its population nourished. Carney refused. Not through outrage, not through spectacle, through a formal, recorded, globally delivered rejection that registered Canada's food security obligations to vulnerable nations in the permanent files of international bodies before Washington could frame the demand as anything other than exactly what it was. Canadian wheat feeds the planet. Canada decides who receives it, when they receive it, what they pay, and on what terms. That is sovereignty. That is what has been defended across every resource, every pricing arrangement, every legal filing this trade war has generated. Today, it was defended in the place where the stakes feel most immediate and most human, the place of food. We are tracking every development on this story daily. If you found this valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening. If this kind of analysis is what you've been looking for, clear, factual, fast, and updated every single day, then subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you never miss the moment a story like this breaks.